Welcome back to Pillow Talk Sessions. I'm Christian Lipinski, joined as always by my co-host, Jessica Gillingham.
Thank you, Christian. Today we're joined by Jason Hardman, who is Head of UK Living for CBRE. Jason brings a unique perspective on how the UK's living sector is evolving across build-to-rent, co-living and also student housing.
Today we'll be exploring the evolution of housing models, how government policy is shaping development, and what the Renters Reform Bill means for operators and investors alike.
Jason, thank you so much for coming on the Pillow Talk Sessions podcast. It's really good to see you again and have you as a guest. So thank you for that. Before we get into the nub of our questions and our conversation today, I'd love it if you could give us an introduction of yourself and also CBRE and your role there as well. So over to you, Jason.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm Jason Hardman. I'm an executive director of CBRE UK business. My role is as head of the living sector for the UK advisory business. So what that means is that I work across all of our lines of business and services within the UK, working with clients to help them find solutions across all of the sort of subsectors, from student to single family housing to strategic land, to sort of the whole living spectrum, and that includes our capital markets activities, valuations, sales and leasing and planning. So it's a very, very broad spectrum, but my principal role is to help sort of the business grow and obviously help our clients find solutions in doing that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jason. That is a big role and an exciting time to be in the industry as well and to be part of it. So we're really interested in hearing some of your thoughts today across the whole of the living. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to agree with Jessica on there. We have a lot of really interesting topics for you today. And I think we should just kick off to the first one, because the first topic we want to discuss is, the evolving housing models. We just came back from the ARL annual conference, and there was lots of different talk going on. But as we know that the living sector is experiencing, its biggest structural changes in decades. From your point of view, what shifts are the most urgent to move beyond the outdated, box building approaches and create housing that reflects how the next generation wants to live?
Well, that's a great question to start with, and yeah, I mean the housing sector is certainly evolving, but it's a bit of a sort of a big kind of oil tanker moving very, very slowly. I mean, what I think about is if you kind of go back sort of a generation or so, 40 years or so, in terms of how people kind of live their lives, and you could break it down into some relatively sort of small segments of your adult life. And, I kind of say that's like the pre-family, you come out of education, perhaps the box bit that you're talking about is the family piece, and then you've got when the sort of if you're having offspring, they've flown the nest, or you're retiring, and you're that post-work part, and I think to my mind are sort of the way that we've approached housing should really reflect the changes in terms of how now, when we're in sort of sitting in 2025, those parts of our lives have evolved. And I'm not sure that our approach to housing has quite evolved in the same way. And I guess what I mean by that is if you again, wind the clock back to 40 odd years ago, we had half the number of renters. So the amount of people who kind of rented was was broadly about 50% from around about sort of 82 or 83 or so. We've now got more people going into going to university, so more people in sort of going into sort of PBSA. More people are probably living independently before they start a family. We've got more households. I think then you possibly get into the box bit of your sort of family living. Of course, that is will remain a key part of the housing market. And then, of course, we're living longer, and when people are flown, then when we're an empty nester or our life after work is that much longer, and we're that much healthier, we're that much more independent. So I think we need the housing to reflect that change in structure. So I think what that means, for example, is, and we've kind of seen that over the last kind of 20 years, is more housing for students. I know that is probably a mature part of sort of the living sector investment market, where purpose-built student accommodation has really been a key part of it, and is relatively mature now. But I'm not sure that our policies kind of cater adequately for it. There's lots of course there is lots of support for students in some towns and cities, but not everyone likes students, and we know that students sometimes behave in a particular way, but they do bring a significant amount to local economies, and planning for that appropriately, I think, is important. You would have obviously heard, I'm sure, at the ARL the conference last week, about things like co-living or micro-living. It kind of doesn't matter what you really kind of call it, but we probably had the rite of passage, I guess, of sometimes individuals sort of sharing houses with their with their friends. Is quite a challenge now, particularly in places such as London, where we're seeing housing stock, the rented housing stock, disappearing for all sorts of reasons, and I'm sure we can kind of we'll come on to talk about those type of things. But they still kind of want to live together, they want to be together. Young people, generally speaking, kind of want to be sociable. So we do need to support and recognise that. I think it's quite interesting that in the paper that came out a couple of weeks ago about trying to accelerate development in London and changes to policies, there was no mention of, or co-living was actually specifically excluded from that, in terms of some of the lowering of affordable housing potentially. I know it's all subject to consultation, and maybe that will kind of change. So there's quite a lot of things that I think to reflect, and you could kind of go on and say, well, we then we've got a higher proportion of renters, so let's make sure that is a recognised part of policy. I think it has had it's definitely been supported to a greater degree over the last 10 years, but it still has a relatively low understanding, I think, from a politician's or a planning officer's perspective. Box building, as I said, is kind of really, if you want, I'm not quite sure that's the right phrase, but sort of family living, of course, is still going to be the biggest share of the housing market. So retains its sort of its importance. And then we go to, well, when you kind of got a bit more free time and more independence, but perhaps you don't want such a big house or your box, to use your term terminology, and where do you go? And that that part of the market, I think, is a nut that everyone is trying to crack in terms of providing sort of integrated communities, or just better or different different types of housing offers or products for more older parts of the population.
Thank you, Jason. That's a really great overview there. I have a question for you. Is there a particular sector within living that you're most excited about for its growth potential? And then which one do you think institutional capital is most, I guess, excited about or most keen to be part of?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of gone in waves. I think there's many parts of the living sector, or places where people live, that the institutional capital wants to contribute to. Affordable housing, absolutely. I think that leaving that aside just for a second, what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of institutional capital buying houses, and that is an easier thing to do at the moment, because that is they're easier to build, they're lower risk when it comes to letting them, because you can do one kind of house at a time. I think that is really exciting at the current moment in time, because the other thing that does, particularly when we're in a period where sales rates for new homes are relatively have been slower than they've been historically, is that the investors buying houses, tend to call it single family housing, can really accelerate the rate of development, particularly on larger scale schemes. So in terms of helping that aim for the government to get to increase house building, it's currently, to my mind, playing a very key part.
So, Jason, the next thing that we wanted to talk about is, government targets and housing quality. The UK's government's pledge of 1.5 million new homes has raised questions about quality and location. How should policymakers and developers balance the delivery targets, but also with the need for the sustainable, high-standard urban living?
Yeah, I think the challenge about 1.5 million homes is, of course, the need to move, the need to move quickly, in terms of that's a big ask for for kind of a single parliament. I think really, the quality point to me is, I think we've probably got with legislation around building safety and changes in building regulations and design in recent years, I think we've probably got the framework now for the highest standards that we've kind of ever been. I think the challenge is probably making sure that is hardwired into planning, because the building regulatory environment and planning don't necessarily run absolutely in parallel. And I think there is a piece that the house building sector needs to adjust to those new regulations. So there will always be a kind of lag from when new regulations come in and sort of the new products kind of come out. Actually, you kind of start to see it. And I think we certainly have seen across, coming back to the single family housing point where institutional capital is also driving higher higher standards, particularly from a sustainability perspective, and demanding ever higher EPC standards or as well. I think there is still an education piece though from a consumer perspective, because there's a bit of a mismatch between sort of value and cost, with the customer not necessarily entirely valuing or attributing a value to all of the costs that might be attributable to achieving some of those sustainable aims. So there is a bit of a balance, which is challenging at the moment.
With these targets, Jason, that the government has set, where does sort of regeneration and reuse of existing properties and existing schemes fit into that? And is there a way for making sure that design and sustainability still fits in if we do go down regeneration routes and things?
I think the regeneration of existing places is absolutely critical. I think we haven't seen, and it's been challenging from an economic perspective, large scale development really in towns and city centres since post GFC. So what does regeneration bring to town centres? Well, it brings activity, it brings GDP, and it creates a much better kind of environment. It will attract commercial and retail occupiers, restaurants, etc., leisure. So I think it's not if the question is should we be thinking not just about sort of greenfield or sort of fringe or urban extensions and new towns? Yeah, the urban sort of renewal is to my mind absolutely critical.
With new regulations putting residents at the center, how do you see the renters reform bill reshaping landlord-tenant relationships, compared to past legislation? And what kind of opportunities does it create for operators to differentiate?
Yeah, so it's the most significant piece of legislation and therefore change to the sort of landlord and tenant relationship from a housing perspective that we've had since the 1988 Housing Act. So it's really, really important, and there's obviously opportunities, and there's obviously challenges with it, but it's a lot of change. I think one of the changes it has had is there's barriers to entry. I think from a landlord's perspective, as well as kind of fiscal and financial measures. Those are one thing, but the standards now that a landlord will have to fulfill, can only be a good thing to be providing good quality housing and like a fair deal to those who are occupying and those who are renting. I do think that from an institutional perspective, from a professional landlord's perspective, that therefore gives opportunities, because there should, in theory, and we'll see whether it works out in practice, it should mean that tenants are and their customers are attracted to that, and renters will be moving towards those types of products, or those types of flats, or those types of houses, rather than sort of the lower quality. But of course, there are going to be challenges in terms of changes to operations, the end of periodic tenancies, the end of fixed term tenancies and movement to periodic tenancies, get it the right way around. I think one of that has to be a balance, because the landlord is there from to provide good quality housing, but expects it isn't doing it there for free and for love. So there has to be a balance in terms of some of the regulatory environment that's going to be put around it to ensure that it doesn't go too far and isn't too onerous, and that we don't see some of the institutional landlords say, well, this is actually now too difficult. I don't think that is likely to happen, but there are of course things like where the management of increases in rents on an annual basis. It's just going to have to be a careful balance. But I think on the whole, it's a positive thing, and we want to be able to maintain high standards within our rental stock in the UK.
So this brings us, thank you, Jason, to a topic that we talk about quite a bit on this podcast, which is the hotelisation of the living sectors. And I guess what we mean by that is how a customer-centred approach, which you would typically see in the hotel sectors, is kind of infiltrating the living sectors. And it's definitely talked about. Whether we see that always in practice, maybe not so much. But what are your thoughts on that? The hotelisation, the sort of the experience-led, the service-led provision of housing. Do you think that we're really seeing that? Is it adding value? Is it something that is of a high priority, or are there other things that are of more of a priority? And I guess with the context of the Renters Reform Bill in there as well.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of sort of noise. I think certainly when we first started off with the professionalisation of the rental sector, there was a lot of noise around sort of amenity and gyms and swimming pools and running tracks on roofs and that type of thing. But to me, that's not what sort of the hotelisation is, which I can't say obviously, is about. But I think what it is about service, and hotels take very, very. There's a broad spectrum of hotels, isn't there? So you can have your luxury 5-star, 6-star with your swimming pool and your 24-hour kind of concierge and a very high service level where you really kind of want for nothing. And of course, there is a place for that, and there will be a demand for that from a proportion of the population, of the renter population. But that is going to be a relatively small amount. I think what coming back to the renters reform and the other legislation around quality is it's exactly that. What do people want? Well, they want somewhere safe and warm where if something's broken, it gets fixed. If they've got a problem, they know who to ask. It doesn't have to be around, well, I need to belong and I want to belong to a community. I want to be able to go to the gym in the same building, kind of where I live. So I think it's the sort of the larger share of the market is going to be far more towards the sort of the budget end of the hotel related kind of comparison, and I think that's a good thing, because that does mean that people are trying to raise standards. As I said before, this is about raising the standard of our rental accommodation in the country. So I don't the comparison to the hotel is kind of fair, but I don't think everyone should expect to be for it to be sort of that 4 or 5 star level. It should kind of you kind of still get kind of what you pay for, but there should be a minimum standard. It's clean, it gets fixed, it's safe, and it's warm.
And on top of that, I wonder what your view is on how technology can play a role in all that kind of service-driven, things that we're discussing here, and how big of a role does that play?
I think tech is incredibly important. I think when we're privileged, we get lots and lots of data, particularly from our valuation work, and when we look at what operational costs, the breakdown of them, typically, pretty much always, the biggest cost is the human cost, salaries to kind of paying staff. So at a time when there's new legislation, new things to get to, regulatory environment to get to grips with, higher than longer term average inflation, national insurance costs, etc., etc. The ability to use tech around the management and and finding out what using AI or a bot to find out actually what the problem is, and then to put it into put it into a system to get someone then to kind of come out, just as a simple example, rather than a human doing it, is really important, and that is going to help and I think speed things up. And some of the things that I've seen, it's the kind of, I'm sorry to say, sometimes it's the human bit that actually lets the kind of the service or the management kind of down. That's the kind of the weak link in the chain. So I'm not saying tech is going to be completely foolproof, but perhaps it takes that kind of element out. So it's absolutely, I think it's only gonna help to speed up where things have kind of gone wrong, or give people an answer, to give them confidence that they're in a safe kind of environment and that kind of someone is looking out for them, but there might not actually be a physical person there, but it helps someone to feel safe in the environment where they're living.
Moving on, Jason, to challenges. So we know that investors typically are okay with low returns as long as there's high security. But the kind of the living sectors, the living concepts, do demand innovation and flexibility. So how can operators and capital providers adopt to de-risk some of these models but still have innovation in the sector?
Yeah, I think from an investment perspective, some of those, some of the innovations have come from that space. I mean, you look at things like coming back to single family, and adopting technology that's been created by people like Octopus on zero bills. I can think of an investor that has put money into modern methods of construction. I'm not talking about modular, because that has had some quite spectacular failures. But in terms of trying to change or how we build buildings, or how we insulate buildings with different types of materials. So it isn't that, of course, it is challenging, and it isn't that it kind of isn't happening. But there's different types of pots of capital for different things. I mean, I guess the government has got a huge part to play in this. and the likes of Homes England and the sort of the National Housing Bank, when it's up and running, I guess has got to try and help and support some of these innovative behaviours and ideas, and helping. And it's not just about money, but it's also to help accelerate those that technology by helping people to get onto site quicker. There is obviously a skills gap, etc. So I think it is happening, but it kind of just these behaviours need to be recognised and encouraged.
How do you think that investors can better evaluate risk in emerging living models like co-living or senior rental, where the data and precedent are limited?
Yeah, it is limited. It kind of does exist. I mean, our experience of co-living, for example, is that the occupational demand where it is really, really strong. And actually, I think they probably performed in London stronger than some other parts of sort of rental of rental living. Yeah, of course. And again, it comes down to if I think how has some parts of the market kind of accelerated and others and others not. Well, think about purpose-built student. Whilst I said at the start that it probably needs sort of formal recognition in some planning, in some planning locally. At times in the early days that kind of did work in its advantage, because we've got a whole sector which is built up the fact that actually it didn't have its own use class, and it kind of had a slightly freer reign from a planning perspective in earlier days. There's a bit of a sort of jury is out from a co-living perspective in terms of what exactly is the right planning use. Is it sui generis? Is it C1 as a hostel? But investors want certainty, so providing clarity on and including it in things, as I said at the start, from in terms of sort of where the GLA is potentially going to be having some temporary measures to accelerate housing delivery in London. It's kind of recognising those new models that they have a specific part to play in our housing supply, because I'm sure the sort of the 1.5 million is coming back to your box analogy. Is everyone's thinking, well, it's a 1.5 million boxes, as opposed to being broken down in terms of does senior living or later living count? Does does a co-living home kind of count? And so I think that's an important part to providing some sense of security, that there's a level.
No, that's great. And I think, a lot of interesting things happening in the living sector, especially in the UK. But I got one more question for you, Jason, before we wrap up today's call. Anything coming down from you guys at CBRE? Anything our audience should listen or look out for?
So, I mean, I think what we're trying very hard to do as a business, and I think one thing that we feel passionate about is private and public partnerships, and I think a big part of that is not just sort of local authority sort of money from some normal day-to-day finances, and a lot of them are quite challenging. I think the whole of the local government pension fund reform is something that we're some of my colleagues are kind of knee deep in, and working out how the sort of the pension pots are going to be put together in terms of consolidation, but also we've been working with people like Greater Manchester Pension Fund, or some of my colleagues have, to find local housing solutions, and supporting local development. I think that's going to be part of a key part of helping to ensure that we build as many new homes in the right places, and of the right type, over future years. That has a big part to play. I don't think it's necessarily direct local authority sort of going back to kind of council homes, but I think the local authority pension schemes, going back to your point, Jessica, about they want modest returns, but for secure income streams, providing low cost housing. And I think we have to be quite innovative over what that means, locally, from the local authority pension scheme, has to be one of the potential solutions to that kind of potential funding gap, or the contribution that is required from a private perspective.
It's so interesting, Jason, and complex as well. Thank you very much for helping to uncomplex it for us as well today on the show. So thank you so much for joining us on the Pillow Talk sessions. It's been really good to have you on.
That's great. No, thank you very much for having me.
And that wraps it up for today's episode of Pillow Talk Sessions. Thank you so much for joining us, and to stay connected and never miss a conversation, head over to pillowtalksessions.com to subscribe. You can also follow us on LinkedIn for more insights and interviews with leaders shaping the future of hospitality, multifamily living, and community-driven spaces. Pillow Talk Sessions is brought to you by Abode Worldwide, the strategic public relations agency for tech brands and tech-enabled operators, transforming the way we work, play, and stay. Abode Worldwide creates category leaders and builds brand value across hospitality and modern rental living. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Pillow Talk Sessions.